Great. So I was thinking about this keynote and thinking about what would be a good way to frame it. And I thought that talking about a concept that I've been working on in the past year and that I'm still trying to develop would probably be a good way to bring together all the different, I think, interesting ideas that one would want to discuss in thinking about Lebanon today. So I entitled this talk Sectarian Neoliberalism, with a focus on the social and political economy of Lebanon. So why sectarian neoliberalism, and why should we really care about Lebanon? I think there are three main reasons why this concept would make sense, but also why it would make sense for an audience that is outside Lebanon, not Lebanese, or not necessarily interested in the details of the Lebanese case. First, I think it's important for us to think about sectarian neoliberalism because it moves us beyond the exceptionalism of the exceptionalist approaches and looking at the Middle East, and I'm saying exceptionalism not to say that we should not be attuned to the particular settings of the region, but it plugs the region, including Lebanon, in a broader global capitalist order and a history of economic thought that is still to be told from a vantage point that is not necessarily the Western-centric vantage point. So in saying this, what I mean is that there's nothing really exceptional about sectarianism in the Middle East or in Lebanon, although most accounts on Lebanon focus, and on the Middle East more broadly, focus specifically about this idea of a sectarian conflict of the Sunnis and the Shiites, the Christian and the Muslim. So a rhetoric that is very focused on identity and identity conflict, and that tends in many, many instances to overlook other social structures, and mainly the capitalist structure that shapes a big part of what the systems that govern the regions are. So in fact, capitalism has always needed social differentiation in order to exploit and accumulate capital. In that sense, there's nothing new about this. Capitalism is therefore inherently sectarian. And when I say sectarian, I mean it in its broader sense. So it takes the shape of racialized, gendered, ethnicized, sectarianized social divisions in order to maintain and reproduce a certain social order. Therefore, sectarianism in its modern form in the Middle East, but also more globally, as my claim will become a bit clearer in a bit, is a result of the infiltration of capitalism to the region, rather than a primordial attachment as the essentialist accounts hold. So why should we care about sectarian neoliberalism? Well, because it moves us beyond those exceptionalist accounts, and because it tells us something about the world more generally, rather than an exceptional case that is Lebanon. The second reason why we should, or why I think this is an interesting theoretical framework to adopt, is that it pushes us to revisit Western-centered approaches to the histories of neoliberalism. So this is a history that is often told as a history of, the move away from Keynesianism or state interventionism. There's always the stories of the Chicago Boys and the Chilean experiment with Pinochet's economic reforms, right? Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's and their rolling back of the welfare state, the Washington Consensus. This is usually where we hear about the development of neoliberalism, mainly located at the end of the 70s and early 80s of the past century. So by framing our approach to Lebanon through this lens, what I'm trying to hint at is that there might be a history of neoliberalism that is not located in the West, but that is very much in conversation with these developments in the West. And therefore, I claim that neoliberalism as an economic practice and an ideology started in Lebanon way before theories of neoliberalism emerged in the West. As I will explain in a bit, since the early 1940s, when the whole world was adopting post-war Keynesian economic prescriptions, and where the Arab region was consolidating its post-colonial regimes based on protectionism, nationalization, and some of them called themselves socialist, and also very authoritarian regimes. Lebanon has taken a very different route and has adopted policies that would later appear in the Washington Consensus or in the works of people like Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman as neoliberal prescriptions. These were policies that were already put in place as early as independence in Lebanon, the 43. And therefore they've been in place for a very long time. The third reason why I think it's important to care about Lebanon is that if we're saying that neoliberalism started in Lebanon some 30 years before the global neoliberal turn in the late 70s, then it's worth looking at what happened to this experiment and what it led to. And of course, we're talking about it today at a point in history where Lebanon's financial crisis is described as one of the worst crises in the world since the 19th century. So what does this experiment of dismantling the role of the state in terms of provisions and in terms of intervention to protect society, what does it mean in terms of losing possible accountability, this idea of impunity that we are seeing as a growing phenomenon in the world, but that is a very pushed version in the Lebanese context. Also the ideas and theories like Wendy Brown's concept of neoliberalism as being essentially anti-democratic, the complete control of politics and everyday life by a few oligarchs, and where the state becomes at the service of a certain class rather than plays the role of protecting. And therefore we see what we call today corruption, and I'll come back to this to think whether this is actually corruption or whether this is a system that is based on breeding corrupt behavior, and a rise of divisive identity politics and right-wing populism that take the shape of sectarianism in the Middle East, but also take the shape of racism or identitarian politics and communal politics in other parts of the world. And also this push to a complete destruction of the environment, and of course the global warming crisis that we're seeing today, and an inevitability of war and violence and catastrophes, the latest of which we've seen in Lebanon with the apocalyptic scenes of the port explosion, that have put an end, it's not an end of history, but it's an end to a democratic world where there's accountability and a system that can function. So in that sense, if we're saying that this system that today is flourishing in the world is one that has started in Lebanon some 3 decades before, then I would, I would push it through and say, maybe Lebanon's present could be thought of then as the world's future. And I know that this is probably a scary thought, but maybe one worth pondering upon. So before I delve into talking a bit more about the specific case of Lebanon and how its sectarian neoliberal system took shape, let me start by explaining what I mean by sectarian neoliberalism. I bet the sectarian part is probably a bit easier, but I'll just to get it out of the way, neoliberalism is of course a very contested term. I still insist on using it because I think that it has currency in explaining the case at hand. I understand neoliberalism as a particular ideology, a set of beliefs, and political programs that were informed by those beliefs, and therefore that developed mechanisms and prescriptions such as privatization, deregulation of financial markets and of labor markets, an agenda that favors financial capital, so banks, hedge funds, etc., at the expense of productive sectors such as the industry or agriculture. And therefore, the understanding of neoliberalism or of neoliberal capitalism is one that is not based on the idea of a complete rolling back of the state and a free economy. To the contrary, it is one where the state does interfere, but it interferes to protect the interests and to maintain a certain class, and that is, of course, the ruling class. So what is Lebanon and many countries in the region and around the world, mainly in the global south, are usually approached specifically in the field of political science under the paradigm of the deeply divided societies. And here I'd like to stop a minute and think about what is so deep about deeply divided societies. Where does this term come from and what does it mean? Especially that, I mean, from where I stand as a sociologist, speaking of a deeply divided society seems very illogical because we have not heard so far of any shallowly divided society or any non-divided society. Social divisions are existent everywhere. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, there's a new word order that emerged, and that was dominated by politics of identity and a rise of conflicts that took the shape of ethnic, communal, sectarian civil wars. And at that time, political scientists in the West were preoccupied with the question of democracy and stability. How do we move from war to post-war societies, and how do we make sure that these societies are stable? And this is exactly where this paradigm of the deeply divided societies emerged and made its way very quickly to policy circles to shape constitutions and policy prescriptions. I mean, the latest probably one can think of Libya and Iraq, where their constitutions have been written with this paradigm in the background. So these were debates that started initially within academic circles and mainly within political scientists who were like Liphart, Lustig, and others, who were discussing initially what they would qualify as fragmented system or deeply divided systems. So it was about political systems rather than societies per se. But then we see in the literature a slip in this discussion from a description of political systems as deeply divided or as fragmented to a description of societies per se as fragmented or divided. And this is a description that we started to see with a lot of plural societies where identity is a salient political mobilizer. And therefore, these debates have set the agenda for policy-oriented discussions on consociationalism, or what we call power-sharing systems in much of the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world. The pillars of this paradigm remain highly questionable. Because if we're saying that there are some societies that are deeply divided, it assumes that there exist societies that are not deeply divided. And then when we look a bit deeper into this, what we realize is that deep divisions under this understanding are always vertical divisions and never horizontal ones. So it's a paradigm that completely overlooks, for example, class divisions that are, of course, very deep in most societies, and that focuses on vertical divisions as the most salient type of division and the ones that require special types of government or of a political system in order to manage those divides. But still, even if we try to think with this paradigm, it is not clear, or at least, or maybe it is clear, that there's a very strong colonial influence, because I mean, can you think of any society around the world that is more deeply divided than the US? A racial divide that has shaped the politics and the history of that country for such a long time. But why don't we talk about the US within this framework of the deeply divided societies? And why don't we say that we need a special type of governance that is based on power sharing between the blacks and the whites in the US, for example? So these are just some examples to tell you So these are just some examples to tell you how this whole sectarian, exceptionalist, deeply divided society paradigm does not really help us alone in explaining what is happening. So in developing this concept of sectarian neoliberalism that, just from the sound of it, is clearly akin to to theories of racial capitalism, I'm trying to think about, or to again place Lebanon and the region in a broader discussion, in a global discussion about the relationships between those identitarian divides and capitalism, the relationships between race, gender, ethnicity, and all of these social structures that shape our everyday life. So I'm not trying to say that there's no sectarianism, of course, but how does it intersect with class divisions and with an economic system that create the realities that unfold in the region? Now, theoretically, it is, of course, interesting to bridge between the theories of racial capitalism and to think about broadening it or bridging it with theories of or what I call sectarian neoliberalism. And what is specifically interesting in this exercise is that sectarian neoliberalism, unlike theories of racial capitalism, relies or explains social divisions that are not as sticky in their hierarchies as the racial system or even the gender order. So while in racial capitalism, there's a history of slavery, there's a clear hierarchy of races. Similarly, with patriarchy or the gender order, there's a clear hierarchy. With sectarianism, this hierarchy is way more fluid, and therefore it is one that is more difficult to grasp, but maybe also one that can open up spaces for theorizing and combining those theories together to come up with a more global approach that looks at this phase of neoliberalism of global, or what I call global sectarian neoliberalism. And sectarian is again understood very broadly here and could include any kind of social divide, where social hierarchies can shift more quickly, and where positions are more fluid, and therefore which calls for a deeper understanding of the political economy of those positions or those hierarchies, and an intersectional approach to understanding what we call today identity politics, beyond the groupist, as Brubaker would say, beyond the groupist approach of thinking of groups and societies as homogeneous and one. So in that sense, sectarian neoliberalism is to be understood as a social order that can at once exploit and benefit the same social group based on an individual's position within the grid of political allegiances, patronage networks, gender, race, or class privileges. And in looking more deeply at the Lebanese case, it has developed what I would call a mafia rule that is governed by these clientelist relationships based on sectarian political leaders and their constituencies. A last point I want to raise in this broader theoretical framework that I'm proposing here is an inherent contradiction in the term itself that I'm aware of and that I'd like to keep, because I think it's this contradiction that is really pushing the theorization behind this. And this is the contradiction between sectarianism and how we understand it as a communal bond, and neoliberalism, which is a system that is so heavily entrenched in individualism. And this contradiction between individualism and communalism, if you like, that makes the term almost an oxymoron, is important because it is actually a contradiction that exists in understanding those social dynamics. And it's a bit like the oxymoron of what political scientists have called consociational democracy. It's a term that has two words that are almost contradictory. How can democracy be consociational? So this is a tension that I'm keeping there, because I think it's an important dialectic understanding of social relations. I'll move now a bit closer to the Lebanese case, and I'll try to explain or go back to this history where I'm saying that neoliberalism, or traits of what today we call neoliberalism, of course, because theorists of neoliberalism have never themselves called it neoliberalism. It's always been called as such by their critics. None of them have theorized it as neoliberalism. But going back to the history of this ideology in Lebanon, I'll try to sketch that history very quickly for you, and lay down the ideological foundations of the Lebanese state from Michel Chiha, whom you see on your, I guess it would be on your left, to Rafiq al-Hariri, who is on your right. And I've chosen those two photos on purpose to reflect on this foundation, or this history of neoliberalism, or this political economy of sectarian neoliberalism in Lebanon. And the first one, we see Michel Chiha, who was a very influential figure, a banker, a politician, a writer, a journalist, who owned two newspapers, the most prominent ones. Of course, as a banker, he was the son of the person that established the first bank in Lebanon, that was called the Pharaon and Chiha Bank. And Chiha is, of course, his family, his father's family. Pharaon is his mother's family. So you see very clearly the class background he comes from. And he played an important role in drafting Lebanon's constitution and shaping its economic model. And he was a fierce defender of Lebanon's Western traits. In that photo, we see Michel Chiha as an inward-looking thinker who was focused on Lebanon, on its distinct political and sectarian identity, and on trying to come up with a special economic model for this miraculous country. And this was, just as a historical context, this was a period, so we're talking here about the 1920s, when Lebanon was under the French mandate after the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And those were the years right before Lebanon got its independence in 1943. On the other hand, we see an outward-looking Hariri, which Hariri is, of course, a billionaire businessman. He's, like Chiha, a very rich man, but one that has come from a completely different social background. He does not come from a family of wealth, but he is part of a new class of oligarchs that have emerged during the civil war, and that have entered political life in Lebanon in the aftermath of the Taif Agreement in 1989. Hariri has played a major role. So he was a prime minister of Lebanon for a long time after the civil war. And he's played a prominent role in the economic plan and an economic vision for reconstruction, the reconstruction period after the war, a very pushed further neoliberalization, an important role in dismantling labor organizations or unions, high privatization, and further financialization of the economy. And that post-war order, instead of building an economy that is financed by taxes, Hariri went for an economy that is financed by debt, which is, again, a typical neoliberal prescription. And what we are witnessing today is probably the result of that post-war sectarian and economic order that was put in place and that created one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in history, and that it exploded in our face today. So I just want to go back a bit to lay down this historical development of both the sectarian and the neoliberal foundations of the Lebanese state. So at the beginning of the ideology of Michel Chiha that was at the core of the development of the Lebanese idea or the Lebanese ideology and its economic model was one that was, as Chiha said, Lebanon should be a promised land for anxious minorities. So he was very much focused, and him and of course the other theorists that were around him were very much focused on this idea of preserving the Christians in the Middle East, of anxious minorities finding a safe haven in the Lebanese polity, and therefore theorized for what became called consociational democracy or sectarian power sharing as the only solution. Chiha famously says that in Lebanon, sects have replaced classes, and he says anyone that tries to analyze the Lebanese society from the vantage point of class dynamics will completely miss out what is happening. Lebanon is a mosaic of sects, and it should only be thought of and understood this way. Another important pillar of his thinking and of the way he molded the state that is called Lebanon, and that is just 100 years old, is when he says that Lebanon's commercial life, like its intellectual life, lives on freedom. And this idea of freedom is one that was, he meant it in an economic way, and of course in a social way as well, as commercial freedom, as a very high value for private property, preservation of low taxes, a laissez-faire economy, no welfare spending. So again, unlike most countries, unlike all countries in the region, so Lebanon was the only country at that time in the region that had a laissez-faire economy and open door policies with no trade barriers. So he was completely against protectionism. And that at that time, it was quite remarkable because that was going against the global trend. And of course, a deregulation of labor and industry, privatization, and a heavy focus on financial capital and the banking sector and the service sector, Lebanon as the country of tourism in the region. In that sense, the state played only the main role that the state would play is to protect and facilitate the flourishing of an emerging class of merchants and bankers, of whom Chiha himself was a main figure. So he kind of concocted a system that preserves his class at the expense of the rest. So in that sense, Lebanon became put in a situation that is very, very different from the rest of the region, and therefore it became the bank of the region. That was also the time when, if we think about 1943, the Nakba in Palestine, Lebanon became the place where most rich people in the region would send their capital. It was also the period of nationalization in most neighboring countries. So again, capital flight to Lebanon seemed to be the most logical way to preserve the wealth of the oligarchs of the region. And therefore, those years that came right after independence in 1943. And a little detail that is important is that the independence in 1943 brought as president the son-in-law of Michel Chiha. And again, so looking at those networks, it explains a lot the political economy of that system, those familial networks that build the state and that were able to push through and to install an economic and a political model that, of course, then created a social model that fits and preserves that specific class of mainly Christian and Sunni traders and bankers in Lebanon. As I said, money started to come into the banking system in Lebanon for three main reasons. One, it was the only country in the region that had a free market and a flourishing banking sector. Two, it had regulations that were very attractive. So a freedom of capital movement, people could bring in and out money the way they want. And what we still have until today, probably we're the only country in the world, banking secrecy. So if you put your money in the banks in Lebanon, they are preserved under a banking secrecy law that makes it a really attractive place to place those huge amounts of money that were accumulated in the rest of the region. This has created what has been celebrated as the economic miracle of the 50s of the post-independence Lebanon, as a great system whereby the economic model has created a flourishing economy, a growth that we talk about without necessarily saying that it has been since then a jobless growth, so a growth that in the financial and the service sector that does not create jobs, and at the same time a celebrated stability between the sectarian components of the country because of those years where there was no war. So while the story is told as a very nice, brilliant story of development in the post-independence Lebanon, we never really understand how did we get to a civil war that was so violent and that lasted 15 years. And the answer lies in actually those years that were celebrated and how this economic system and a political sectarian system have created social tensions that were bound to explode in the end, and what took the shape of a civil war. So part of the big plan that was put forth in this Chiha vision was the development of Beirut as a capital and a neglect of the peripheries, and then a dying out of the sharecropping system, and therefore a dying out of the agricultural system, and a huge wave of migration, specifically from South Lebanon, where there's the biggest Shia community, to the capital. And why South Lebanon? Well, for two main reasons. One, it's because agriculture was dying there, and people lived mainly off agriculture. So when that no longer became a source of income for people, they had to migrate. The second reason is that with the establishment of the State of Israel and the closure of the southern borders in Lebanon, the economic viability of the region that relied heavily on commerce with Palestine came to a halt. So Lebanon, so Beirut was the only so we have not seen a similar, we've seen similar waves of urbanization and of movement to the capital from other parts of the country, the north, but the south witnessed the biggest one, mainly because of those two reasons. And as sociologist Fuad Khouri explains, when these communities started to move to the capital and formed around the capital what is called the belts of misery, the poor neighborhoods where people from villages and from the mountains came to work in blue-collar jobs in the capital, and what it created a system whereby those rural migrants became more and more conscious that their communal identity was way more important for their survival in the city than any other kind of allegiance. And this is when a clientelistic system flourished and gave way to this vertical stratification of society along sectarian lines, and a shaping of clientelistic system networks of non-state welfare, because Lebanon never had until then a welfare state. The state institutions do not provide any welfare. It's only later on. For example, it's only later in the 60s that there was the first attempt at building a national university. The educational system was completely privatized until then. So in that sense, it enhanced the use of sectarian patronage and the flourishing of local sectarian leaders. So those years between the 1950s and 1975 were years of heightened social struggle, economic hardship for large sections of society. And this is when there was a very short period of an attempt at establishing some welfare policies by General Fuad Shahab, who came as president, and who tried to establish a few things such as social security, but that remained a short-lived experience, and today we are witnessing the complete dismantling of those very little gains of that period. So we moved in that sense from a pre-war era that was an era of merchants and bankers, the Merchants' Republic, with banking and tourism as the economic core and sectarian clientelism as a coping mechanism. We moved, so I'll fast forward to a post-war period that witnessed the development of a war economy that is based on what I will call a mafia state that has ripped the spoils of the state and transformed its citizens to hostages in this sectarian fantasy world. Non-state or parastate welfare flourished, and local sectarian leaders became in many cases, the only lifeline for most families in the countries. And I call this a mafia state and a war economy for three main reasons. One is that the war has deeply transformed the sectarian geographies and therefore the economic structures as well of Lebanese society. This move, there was an amnesty law at the end of the civil war that moved us, just turned the page and jumped very quickly to a post-war Second Republic, where the same militia the same militia warlords became the politicians. They only wore nice suits and claimed that they are the saviors. And so therefore, this transformation determined the economic, political, and social behavior and structure that governs the lives of most citizens in terms of housing, for example. So very simple decisions such as where to live in the city, the geography of those sectarian tensions, but also, the different, how neoliberalism has also transformed and pushed people out of certain neighborhoods to, to outside the city, to some suburbs. it has also transformed work opportunities, access to healthcare or education, etc. So it's a complete transformation that that has really changed the way the sectarian neoliberal order worked in the pre-war order. Again, as I said, sectarian, the second reason is that the sectarian clientelism became way more blatant than pre-war period, and any hopes or even any discussions of a possible welfare state evaporated with the heavy defeat of the left and of left-wing parties in the broader political sphere in Lebanon, and the very heavy crackdown on labor mobilization in the post-war period. So, for example, one of the biggest social movements in the history of labor mobilization in Lebanon is the mobilization of the Ghandour chocolate factory workers in the 70s. I'll just give you just very, very quickly to tell you what I mean by how this neoliberalization has transformed this social fabric, but also social struggles. This factory, this chocolate factory, today, the site of it, and this was a very contentious site because it's also the line that divided later on during the war. This was the demarcation line that divided the Beirut between East and West Beirut. Today, this factory, that is a historical site for people interested in labor struggles, has become a mall. It's a temple for consumerism. It has become a mall called Beirut Mall, and the factory is no longer there. And there's this whole history of struggle was kind of erased. The third reason I would call what we have today a mafia state and a war economy is that, unlike what we usually think when we talk about clientelism or when we talk about sectarian patronage, it is not only about financial gains. It's not only about, people don't just follow those sectarian leaders because they will give them a job or because they will maybe pay their children's tuition or waive or give them access to healthcare, etc. It is true that there's of course the structure is there and it explains the political economy of sectarianism and of why people follow those leaders. But the other important pillar of this clientelistic system is one that is very much linked to the war economy and the persistence of sectarian anxiety. And today, the clientelism is probably more about providing safety and protection rather than just providing financial gains. Especially now with the financial collapse, we see that a lot of the militia, the sectarian parties or militias, they continue a militia rule that is based on protection, that is based on safety rather than just based on financial gains. Of course, this is also a very gendered system. So when I talk about sectarian neoliberalism, I'm also talking about how this has created a huge, of course, a patriarchal system, a patrilineal system where until today, Lebanon has no civil code, and therefore we have 15 different sectarian codes that govern the private lives of citizens and mainly women. We have one of the lowest rates of women participation in politics in the world. We have one of the highest rates of female unemployment in the world. So these are all indicators of how gendered as well the sectarian neoliberal system is. So moving quickly, since I'm aware that we don't have much time left, what I'll show you here a series of images just to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. We are all beggars, and I'm trying to argue that begging has become an economic model. Lebanon's economy is based on debt, aid, and Ponzi schemes, mainly what we call the Dutch disease, an economy that relies on an influx of capital from outside without any sector that is productive. So you have that creates a financial capital market without a real economy to sustain it. It has also seen the flourishing of, although it presents itself as a free market economy, it is actually an economy that is very heavily based on cartels and monopoly, and cartels and monopolies that are sustained and governed by sectarian leaders, and therefore they use them to reproduce their sectarian clientelism. And a very simple example is electricity. So we probably know, until today, Lebanon in summer had a complete blackout. Until today, Lebanon has no electricity. It is not nuclear science to bring electricity in such a small country. It is exactly sectarian neoliberalism. It's a decision not to provide electricity by the state, but rather to provide it by private generator owners who are linked to these networks of sectarian clientelism and who make billions out of selling generator electricity. Therefore, there's no economic logic for those ruling the state to actually have a working energy sector in Lebanon. This economy has also this economy that is based on begging, on aid, on influx of money from abroad, and on not creating jobs. So Lebanon has very low appetite for people who have high qualifications. There's no economy that can absorb them. Just to give you figures, there are 32,000 entrants to the labor markets every year, or graduates. In the best years, the Lebanese labor market has opened only 5,000 positions. So we're talking about around 27,000 youth every year who will not find a job, not because they're not qualified, not because there's a mismatch between education and the job market, simply because there are no jobs, simply because the economy has no jobs. And therefore, in that sense, most Lebanese are born to be exported. They're born to spend their youth in Lebanon, get an education, and then leave the country and work abroad and send in the hard currency, send in the dollars, and this is how the economy sustains itself. It's a highly dollarized economy that is heavily reliant on imports because there's no production, is very little. So Lebanon imports around 80% of its consumption, and that includes basic needs such as fuel, wheat, medication, etc. So it heavily needs an influx of dollars from abroad. So this has all exploded in 2019 in what has been known as the Lebanese uprising that happened in the context of decades long, since it can only be understood within the broader context of the first wave of Arab uprisings in 2011 and the subsequent movements that developed in Lebanon, but also in what has been called the second wave of Arab uprisings that started in Algeria and Sudan and spread to Iraq and Lebanon. When the uprising happened in October 2011, it was this context of years of high mobilization. However, what was different at that point is that these were the protesters. Images that we were not very used to seeing in previous waves of protest that were mainly led by a middle-class professional civil society that is, that many of whom work in NGOs, a sector that is, very big in Lebanon. So while there's this big NGOized civil society in Lebanon, October 2019 was different because it was the first time that the mobilization was of such a scale and a scope and mobilized a very, very different component of society. It was those guys that you see here, what in Algeria they would call them the Haitists, and the unemployed youth that were just sitting in the streets, smoking their shishas, and an expression of what what unemployment would look like. And these are also images from the first 2 days of the uprising. So it was also an uprising that took this shape of, riots, of a bit of violence, a very insolent revolution with a lot of curse words, like breaking taboos, even if at the rhetorical level, cursing all figures under the slogan of kullun yani kullun, so all of them means all of them, to say that these are people who are against all sectarian leaders. Now, of course, I mean, this is a social group or social constituent that usually would have been the typical clients in the clientelistic network. So those would have been the ones who would need the sectarian leader to be able to find a job or to flourish or to protect themselves. And that break that happened in 2011 and 2019 was revolutionary, and I insist on calling it a revolution. I'm happy to discuss more why. It was revolutionary in that it had a very clear class component, and it really cornered the sectarian neoliberal system, even if just in the first 3 days, because the dynamics have changed later on. So I'll very quickly show you a few photos from the uprising to show you what I mean. So these are some graffitis, and just look at how focused people were on, or how aware. I mean, there was a moment of clarity where people saw very clearly that the sectarian system and that the oligarchy that is governing the country are actually one, and not the opposite, and that those sectarian leaders are not going to protect us from each other, but they are actually protecting themselves from us. But also a very global outreach. I mean, these are slogans that we've seen everywhere in the world, from Chile to Hong Kong, right? Eat the rich, a clear crisis of neoliberalism that expressed itself this way in Lebanon. Here we see graffiti saying "down with the oligarchy," that is sprayed in front of the central bank. This is another graffiti that says that the syndicates belong to the revolutionaries, and this is when a series of an attempt at revamping the labor movement and creating alternative unions started at the beginning of the uprising, when people realized that it's very difficult to push through the next stage of the uprising without any social organization or political parties that can play that role. Being against capitalism also clearly expressed in Lebanon and elsewhere in the world. An interesting aspect was this graffiti that says "down with proposals," and again, a clear rejection of the NGOized logic that governed post-war Lebanon's activism in terms of mobilizing for single issue causes, a very NGOized civil society that works based on the funding and what donors perceive as priorities. So it was really smashing this whole system. Also, the faces of the counter-revolution were clear in showing themselves as we see here. It was not too long before the sectarian aspect or the state deployed the sectarian again, when we started to see clashes between people who would mobilize with very sectarian, mainly Shia, slogans and attack the protesters. So on one hand, we saw again the counter-revolution took the shape of the re-emergence of the sectarian. And in the other photo on your right, you see the army protecting the association of banks in Lebanon. So again, very clearly, just visually, the role of the state in protecting the banks rather than protecting the citizens or the depositors who have lost all of their deposits that were put in those banks. So again, the ideology, the sectarian neoliberal ideology, becomes very clear just by looking at those two images. I think I'm out of time, so I'll wrap up here and I'll say we very quickly moved from the utopia of and the heydays of the revolution to the dystopia of what we're living today. And one of my interviews, someone told me, during the uprisings, during the October Revolution, we did not want to sleep because the dream we were living while awake was much nicer. It really felt like a dream for many people that experienced it. It felt like the moments, the actual presence in those squares felt like living this alternative reality that we long for, and gave hope, even if ephemeral, for a possible change and for a different world to emerge. Now, of course, it's an uprising that was met with many global scale catastrophes. The biggest explosion, the biggest non-nuclear explosion in history that people accuse the government of doing, a global pandemic that happens once every century, happened just a few months into this revolution. One of the worst financial crises in history since the 19th century. So a lot of really, Guinness Book records that have curtailed this uprising, and a huge wave of migration that have changed the composition of the movement, and we've lost a lot of the main organizers and people who are able to agitate. But to end, I'll say that there's this graffiti that I like so much, and that I want us to end with. It says, "We have so much to do," and I don't know who sprayed this, but I think it's someone who realizes the importance of what we do and our agency, and not just sitting back and waiting, but actively participating. I think this is a time of global transformation, from the case study of Lebanon to a broader thinking about a global rise of right-wing populism, a global rise of neoliberalism, the catastrophes that we've seen after the coronavirus, and how many governments around the world have dealt with it. This is, I think, an important time for us to think, to expand our theoretical frameworks, to come up with new understandings of what revolution is. As Jeffrey Page says, revolution has a future, even if many theoretical definitions of revolutions do not. I think today our main exercise, or our main task, is to think of what does revolution mean in the 21st century? What does it mean today to change this neoliberal sectarian word? And what is a future that we can imagine beyond what Mark Fisher calls sectarian realism? So just the possibility of expanding our political imaginaries and of coming up with new or renewed ways of thinking of how do we organize and how do we move forward without losing the hope that we can move forward is probably the most important task we have today. And thank you very much.